idea that Socrates' philosophical practice was a divine mission totally contradicts the idea that philosophy is this academic secular practice. And so you say, well, what was the divine mission? Socrates says it was learning to die before you died. And it's a ritual initiation, and he uses the Greek mystery language terms from the Eleusinian mysteries to describe this practice. So ancient philosophy, as I understand it, and as I practice it, and as I've received it, is a spiritual initiation process which has these secret, and I think they're secret because, one, we can't really talk about them in one sense until we've undergone them. And when we've undergone them, part of, I think, our initiation is to learn what it means to describe them for people. That's helpful.
So the pursuit of desire is always an education of desire. We're always chasing what we desire while also learning what we actually desire. And I love the idea that philosophy helps us get there. The way you're describing it to me is not an abstract intellectual system. It sounds like medicine for the soul.
If you begin with your own personal wondering and you deal, as you say, with your wounds, and you go on the journey of wandering, the work you do will be divine, and it will be magic. It will be magic.
Friends, I don't even know what to tell you about this conversation except that it is amazing. In this show, we explore the idea that our wounds lead us to our wonderings, the questions that are ours uniquely to ask and answer. And those questions lead each of us individually to our wisdom, the wisdom that we need, and also the wisdom that we share, which often shows us what our work is in the world. Along the way, we learned that the quest really is in the questions, that it's about exploration more than explanation, discussing, not defining, as wondering leads to wisdom, and wisdom leads to wonder. In this episode, we get into wisdom as a healing path, and the love of wisdom is called philosophia, philosophy. If you think of philosophers as dry academics, Samuel Loncar is literally the opposite of that. In this episode, he shares with us about philosophy as a love of wisdom, and a magic, and a medicine for the soul, and a guidebook for the healer's journey. Samuel practices the ancient art of philosophy, and I love that. He doesn't just study it. He doesn't just teach it. He practices it. He practices the ancient art of philosophy linked to the origins of science, Western spirituality, and contemplative practice that promotes the perpetual evolution of human potential. He's the editor of the Marginalia Review of Books. He's the director of the Institute for the Meanings of Science. He's the founder of the Becoming Human Project. His Becoming Human podcast is one of my all-time favorites. Buckle up. This conversation is amazing. I enjoyed this so much. My pen could not move fast enough as I was taking notes as we were talking. In the first third of this episode, we explore how our wounds and our wonderings and our wisdom are all intertwined, and we explore the origins of philosophy as a help in healing those wounds. We then geek out about archetypes and logos and Zoe and seeing the story of wisdom underlying all things. And don't stress about the details in this one. Just stay with the magic and the spirit of it. As we move into the last third and we get real weird, talking about everything from why wizards are so popular in contemporary culture right now and what that might be telling us about the moment that we're in, to how philosophers might be better understood as magicians, to the wisdom of each and every one of us facing our own death and our own personal suffering, and why the secret to being fully alive might just be in learning to die before you die. Trust me, you're going to love this one. Welcome back to The Healer with 1,000 Faces with Samuel Loncar, PhD. Samuel, oh my gosh, it's so good to have you here in conversation on the Healer with 1,000 Faces podcast. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mike, thank you. You're welcome. I am so delighted to be here with you. It is good. It's a joy.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one. I'm really glad we were able to make the connection because it's been, true story, I'm about 15 episodes into recording right now, and you are sort of one of my magic wand conversations where I was like, if I could wave a magic wand and get anything, I would love to talk to Samuel about philosophy and wisdom. So really, really glad this worked out.
Me too. Well, hopefully, the spirits will bring the magic.
Oh my gosh, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for. So this podcast is The Healer with 1,000 Faces. What happened, Samuel, is I've recorded something like 300 conversations with different spiritual teachers in the last few years. And it really is an opportunity for me to try to integrate a little bit of what I've been learning. And I had kind of grown up, so to speak, in my education with Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero journey, right? The hero with 1,000 faces. And the more I sat with that and the more I had these conversations, this idea started germinating in my mind of the healer's journey and what it sort of means to put our wounds in the service of healing the world, right? To put our own personal healing in the service of healing the world. And I was seeing this pattern over and over again where it looked like everyone came into life with a sense of wonder and their own talents and potential, but also we all get wounded at some point. And in that process, our wounds very often would set us out on our wandering. They'd shape the trajectory of our life a little bit. And then our wounds would shape our wondering. They might give us the unique questions that were ours to ask and answer. Yours different than mine, mine different than yours. But those wonderings would lead us to our wisdom. And often the wisdom that was ours uniquely would lead us to our work, right? And the idea being that the sort of the medicine that I need is my medicine to give to the world. And I have a few very specific questions on where I want to dive in with you on that. But before I go any further, first of all, does that make sense? Like, does that pattern in any way, shape, or form bear out to anything you've seen or experienced in your own life and the many folks that you've studied?
It does. It makes sense intellectually, existentially, poetically. I love it. From sort of the wound to the wondering, and the wandering to the wondering to the wisdom, and then the work. I think that is, in a way, in fact, I think the poetry of it I really appreciate, because in Becoming Human Origins, I remember I talked about, right, the idea that I think the first wound we all receive is birth. We're born in a context which is, for our mothers, utterly excruciating. Most women would say giving birth is the most painful thing they've ever done. And so there's this ancient idea, like in Socrates, and who was famously, his mother was a midwife. And Socrates actually described the art of philosophy as a form of midwifery. And in fact, Socrates' total orientation towards feminine teachers and feminine metaphors is a radical subversion of his own patriarchal Athenian context, in which men were just in charge. Women were honored as goddesses, and we could talk about all that. But Socrates constantly frames philosophy as a maieutic or midwifing art, because the trauma of birth is exactly what gives rise to the general human questions that we have. And then I think, as you say, we receive individual wounds that build on in a sense, the wound of birth, the wound of being separated from like what felt natural, undivided from like our source. And I think coming to terms with that is part of, the individuation process. And if people don't go through that, I think our wounds define us. And I've found that it's the hardest times of life, I think, are when you are waking up to the fact that you're very wounded. And that can seem all defining. And in fact, there's this beautiful, weird way in which it is, in the sense that, as you said, the wounds leave a mark, and from that mark, they leave a path. And I think philosophy, because it begins where we don't have a path, I think it exactly does begin in wounds, because it's scary. You could say not knowing who you are is a big wound itself. And right. Gosh. So I think, I think it absolutely resonates with me. Yeah.
Well, it's you just gave me about 10 different follow-up questions that I want to ask. And so just pulling one out of the grab bag, and then I'd love to get into what philosophy is, and we'll circle back around to Socrates for sure. I think not knowing who you are is terrifying. I'm quite struck with the consistency of this injunction to know thyself, or the question of asking, who are you really? And also how that connects with exactly what you're describing, this idea that when we are born, right? We see this in myths the world over. There's always some version of having to leave Eden, having to leave that place of safety, that home that we then long for the rest of our life. How, and if this question doesn't make sense, you're very welcome to reject it. How is the quest to know ourselves connected to that wound of losing that original connection and safety? Does that question make sense?
I think it does. I think it's a very deep question and in a sense a difficult one. But so I think my own answer might just be more a wandering or a wondering.
Yeah, great.
But I think that, if you think about humans starting very simply, like very biologically, right? Think about a horse or something, right? When they're born, they're standing on their feet basically, overnight. The gestation and the developmental period of us as like these highly developed mammals, it's long, like incredibly long, 9 months. And then the extent of helplessness of the human infant and child is extraordinary compared to the animal kingdom. Like if you think of like being able to get food and feed yourself, like humans are not independent for years. And so I think to go from a state where you don't have to have any awareness, right? The child in the womb has a kind of like emerged awareness, like you said, with this sort of Edenic condition where everything is supplied, everything is provided. At the same time, I think it's important to say we now know, even the context of the humanity of the condition of the gestation can cause trauma. So I think that the path that we follow often begins with just a biological fact that birth is one of the hardest things for us to come to terms with. I think humans are very afraid of their origins. Like we have a primordial fear that if we confront our origins, we will not like what we see. And a lot of our identity is built as an initial cocoon to protect us as we mature and become independent enough to then face that primordial trauma, which is a gift. Like being birthed is a great thing. I'm so grateful to my mother. But to even begin to think, how do I honor that? Like, how do I honor my origins when they're so, in a sense, beyond me? And so I think we encounter transcendence originally in our literal biological past. There's a transcendence built into being born that I think it takes an incredible psychological maturity to begin to even recognize. And I don't know if this is really answering your questions. Maybe you can come back and put the question again. But I think that path of, it can be framed so differently. If you're religious, spiritual, philosophical person could think they're an atheist. But I think most people who've become artists or become healers, they're going to go through a path in which you essentially will discover or feel like your origin somehow ruined you, or defined you in a way that has bound you or imprisoned you. And I think that's not because we did something particularly bad. It's something about the greatness of what human beings are spiritually has to do with this incredible tension between our dependence and our difficulty of coming to terms with our dependence, and the way in which our dependence actually does liberate us once we can accept it. It's not inconsistent with autonomy. We don't create ourselves in that sense of being born, but because we're born, we can recreate ourselves.
Yeah. I love that so much. And it leads me to reflect on the reality that if we look deeply at our wounds, they do often take us back to the womb, right? To our primary wounding, to the beginning. And as I've sat with this and I've had conversations with so many teachers over the last few months and years, I've realized that there's this dichotomy between wounding and a sense of wonder, right? Like it's a miracle to be alive. What a gift. And yes, what a trauma to come into this world. And none of us are born into perfect situations, right? Even those of us who have good enough parents inherit some baggage that we need to work out, or things that are handed down intergenerationally, things that are handed down in the womb, and then the existential conundrums of being alive. That's pretty profound. And then to revisit that wounding is a womb in itself, because it's a perennial opportunity to be remade and rebirthed. Right? Does that
Yes,
track?
I think so. I think that's part of why the return to childhood, like in the teaching of Jesus, Yeshua, is so, again, very subversive culturally. Children were in no way idealized at all at that time, or even for most of the past 2,000 years. If you think about how recent any children's rights are, they're incredibly recent. And I think that baffling kind of injunction to become like a child, that only those who are like children can receive the kingdom of the skies or the kingdom of heaven. I think it has to do with this sort of, you've got to, in a sense, come back to the fact that what sustains you, the umbilical cord, is strangling you once you're independent. And if that isn't cut, you
Yeah.
can't breathe. So the idea, if you say like, is an umbilical cord bad? It's like, it's crazy to say it's bad. But
Yeah.
if you don't detach from that after the actual birthing process, you will die.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, a very deep, not symbol. It's almost like the physical basis of like this process we're talking about in the general form. I think there is the specific ways we manifest it. Because like Jung, I remember this passage in Carl Jung has always lived with me and haunted me. It's an essay where he's talking about a case of like a young girl, 5-year-old. I forgot, but I think it's a fairly famous essay, kind of like Freud's essay, similar, I think, about Anna, but maybe that's the Jung title. But basically, the parents brought their child and like, our child has these problems. And Jung told them, the child has no problems. You're the problem. Like that's what he told them. And
Wow.
in that essay, he said, I remember this line so vividly: a child absorbs the unconscious of their parents like water. Like you just, and so I think the child state, because it's purely receptive, children know so much. In the Jewish tradition, they say you're taught the whole Torah by an angel in the womb. And
Yeah.
then you forget it because of the trauma of birth. Plato says that we saw the forms, we saw eternity, we knew heaven, and then we forget it when we're born. Zoroastrians say that the book of life, you have a book written on you literally in your heart. And the issue is just that humans forget it and they have to recall it. So I don't think all these people directly influenced each other. They might have. There's connections, of course, between Persians, Jews, Christians, which we could talk about. Why the Magi come to Jesus' birth is really interesting. But I
Yeah.
think the idea that there's a book written on us before we're born,
Yeah.
and that we have to find that book, and it's our book. It's somehow universal, binding us to our species existence, and utterly radically particular.
I love that so much. And I see, Merton and others have talked about that as like rediscovering the true self. Richard Rohr, my teacher and friend, talks about it as sort of the immortal diamond. But this idea that there is a deep knowledge within us, Jung's notion of the self with a capital S, as our sort of primary potential, which is at once unknown, but also functionally acts like an internal GPS, driving us towards wholeness in sometimes very scary and reckless ways, right?
Right.
But moving us along to the place of self-discovery. And in Jung's cosmology, that was in cooperation with the divine, with
Right.
all the divine powers, and as such as he understood them, cooperating with us to drive us into the unknown places of our own fractured being, in a continual process of remembering, which is at once, cognitive remembrance and then remembering, reconnecting.
Right.
Yeah, that's profound. And I also really appreciate that image of the umbilical cord. There's a trauma therapist I really like named Bonnie Badenoch. She wrote a great book called The Heart of Trauma. And at the beginning of the book, she talks about how there are these two drives when we're children that we're just born with. And the one is the sort of push to explore. And I'm paraphrasing, so Bonnie, if you're listening and I don't have your words right, forgive me. But the idea is we move towards exploration, then we move back towards safety. And we need the two in dynamic tension, right? You toddle out away from your parents, you get scared, you go back to safety, which then lets you ground so that you can go further out. And yet in that, there must be a continual process of letting go, right? Like that severing of the umbilical cord is probably, do you think that's a lifetime process?
Yeah, well, it's yes, and one that maybe manifests to us often very decisively. I think like a lot of people who are raised in religious traditions, like I was raised in, where salvation is presented as this dramatic one-time thing, and some people feel like, well, that never happened to me. I think it's like it often is both. I think those of us who've been on the healer's journey for a while, I think probably can point to a decisive moment. But the more you heal, you'll have many decisive moments, I think. And so I think it's a lifelong process. And then in some paradoxical sense, it's also often, I think, a definitive, oh, now I feel like I've been cut off. And so, yes, but I wanted to be also an evolution, because I think there's something like I'm always so struck. You probably have seen it. I've watched it so many times. The interview with Jung, it's on YouTube now
Yeah.
from the
Oh, yeah.
BBC. Because
Yeah.
Jung's energy is just really wonderful to be with, I think, and the sense of complete certainty that Jung has, that other people have, for example, in the face of things that otherwise terrify people like death, or this is something that clearly indicates like, okay, there's a sense in which that person is the umbilical cord has been cut in that person.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm sure if we were talking to them about themselves, they would be very aware of all these ways in which it's not been cut.
Yeah.
So I think that as we experience people, we experience them in limited and finite ways in which some people are clearly free and other people are clearly still wandering. Some people are clearly certain and other people are clearly still doubting. But that doesn't mean that in our wholeness, I think we're not always still working through that dependence, working through that connection. But I also think it can manifest as definite stages of transformation where we do achieve a new level of clarity. And we could say, okay, now I'm free. I think the danger in that is if a person thinks, now I'm free in some total sense, then like Jung says, that's often the sign an archetype is hovering, and you can get this ego inflation where it's like, I've got it, I've mastered it. And then that precipitates a kind of correction.
Yeah, the minute you think you have it, it probably has you, and then you're in trouble.
Exactly. Yes.
Goodness gracious. Yeah, Richard, who sort of Richard Rohr in a lot of ways is a very skillful summarizer of Jungian thought, and he borrows a lot from Jung and Walter Brueggemann in describing life moving through these stages of order, disorder, and reorder. And I think a lot of people take those as big stages of life. Like, I'm in order for the first 30 years of my life, and then I move into disorder during my 40s and 50s, and then I figure it out in my 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I move into reorder. And that's fine. That's one way to look at it. That's fine. Richard's been a little more vocal lately, going, no, this is a cycle we're always going through. And if we look at it deeply, it's happening in multiple levels in all kinds of different ways, right? Like, I might be in order over here, disorder over here, and reorder over here in how I am in my cosmology, in my thinking on how people are, in how I relate to myself and how I relate to my family. And of late, Richard's been talking about holy disorder in his latest book, which I internalize as the moment that an umbilical cord is severed and we find ourselves cut off and abandoned or in disorder, and it becomes holy disorder the moment we choose to do it on purpose. To say, this is a journey that I'm on. I'm going to take the journey and I'm going to look for meaning in the midst of it. We haven't even touched the first interview question. But how does that land for you? Does that feel akimbo with what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's very profound and very helpful, because I think often, right, we don't make the choice itself of the separation per se, but then to say, okay, well, we can begin to choose to accept actually this is a good thing, meaning it's going to deliver me. And I also think it's holiness is the right word, because suffering is sacred. Right. Just as there's a kind of sacredness in death, not as in the death itself as a value, but the temple that once housed the life spirit of a person is sacred. All cultures recognize that. And there's something really sad and disturbing about a state of the psychological world in our culture where we don't respect people's suffering enough to not exploit it, or when people are most hurt, maybe because they're doing things that are imprudent. And certainly, I think I know that from my own life. And when you begin to recognize that, you suffer. But if people hurt you, you suffer. But I think if you choose, if this is what war means, that's what I'm getting. It sounds really, again, beautiful and helpful. Is this is actually, I will sanctify this as a site of meaning. I will choose to not think this is here to destroy me. But I will choose to accept that what's being destroyed is just something deeper, more lasting, can be rebuilt. That absolutely resonates with me.
I so appreciate that. I think about when you talk about Jung's certainty, right? I love that interview, and even the casual manner with which at one point they said, "You believe in God?" and he says, "I don't need to believe, I know."
Yeah, I know.
And he's so calm. It reminds me of two things. It reminds me of when I read my great teacher Origen talks about, or it's talked about, I think, and maybe when Eusebius writes about him, him sort of going through the secret teachings of Ammonius Saccas, or, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scholar, so I'm probably mispronouncing names and I don't know all the details. But I see other great teachers in antiquity, and they would go through these secret rites of initiation, after which, there was no fear of death, or there was some type of comfort and ownership of the journey that you were on. And I'm very aware that we don't have rituals like that by and large in predominant Western culture. And I feel like for a lot of people, suffering becomes that initiation, often without a lot of help to make it sacred, right? For me, it was when I read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, that I was like, oh my God, we really can choose to find meaning in the midst of anything. One, I know you know a lot more about this than I do. Can you tell us anything about those ancient rituals and rites that did help people sort of find their way into that? Am I on to anything there? And then two, is that your experience that these days suffering is the initiation that we have? And I'm not offended if you disagree with me.
No, I don't disagree, and I think certainly your own expertise in origin, you're definitely, I think, on the right track. I think it's hard. Let me just say this: I think it's hard to talk about these things because the category of them in the ancient world in Greek was the unspeakable things, and so there was, and let's just start with the relationship between the teacher and the student, right? Like, this is to this day the same in yoga. A real relationship between a student and their guru is bound by secrecy. Like Mircea Eliade famously, as you probably know, many people may know, he did not reveal when he wrote his book on yoga that started his career, this great scholarly book on yoga that had all this academic learning. People did not know that while he was doing that work in India, learning all the languages and studying with Dasgupta and other masters who were scholars, he was also himself attaining a very high level of practice in yoga. But you could think, well, that'd be such a great play as a scholar to like lay out that, by the way, I'm actually, but he never did because it was against the actual tenor of the relationship. You don't reveal anything about what you've learned from your guru unless they explicitly permit it. And that is, I think, very foreign to many Westerners, but it's extremely normal. In the martial arts traditions, like in Asia, it's called being an indoor disciple. It was generally that martial arts skills were only passed on as family secrets to their children. This is the same in Greece. In Greek, they were 12 tribes or phratries, like in Athens, and each tribe had customs and rituals. And then there were some specific to each family that they passed on to their sons. And the mothers passed on to their daughters. This was normal. It was really normal. And it was connected to the fact that writing wasn't as predominant. So I think that's just historical context where this transmission of life-changing secret material from a master to the student, it was a normal thing. And there is something deeply odd about Western modernity that we find it odd and that it no longer exists. And I think that's why Rohr's work is so powerful and resonant, and why there's such a hunger that's just intensifying. I think like a wave reaching the shore, almost like a tsunami spiritually. There's an intensified need to have deep personal connections with people. We know that can also often be exploited. I think we all know if we're teachers, it's hard to learn how to manage that because people project on you. So just in that first point, I think it's a challenging thing to talk about. But on the other hand, it's a very normal thing. And it's an important thing to talk about. And just I'll say a brief thing on it. You can come back if you want to follow up on it. Is we've both talked about the work of Peter Kingsley in the past. And one of the key things in Socrates that this is where I always point people to is read the Apology. It's the text everyone's read or assigned in philosophy classes. It's very short. Socrates is on trial for impiety, and he loses the trial and he gets sentenced to death for essentially practicing philosophy. But what does he say it is? Socrates says his practice of philosophy was a divine mission given to him by the god Apollo, who is the most revered god in the ancient Greek world. And the Delphic oracle was the oracle that gives all the secrets and guided the evolution of the Greek legal system. And it's this system that said, right, written famously, Gnothe Seaton, know thyself. And the idea that Socrates' philosophical practice was a divine mission totally contradicts the idea that philosophy is this academic secular practice. And so you say, well, what was the divine mission? Socrates says it was learning to die before you died. That's literally how he describes philosophy in the Apology. He says it's the practice of dying before you die. And it's a ritual initiation, and he uses the Greek mystery language terms from the Eleusinian mysteries to describe this practice. So ancient philosophy, as I understand it, and as I practice it, and as I've received it, is a spiritual initiation process which has these secret, and I think they're secret because one, we can't really talk about them in one sense until we've undergone them. And when we've undergone them, part of, I think, our initiation is to learn what it means to describe them for people that's helpful.
Yeah.
And not exploitative. So, and then as to the part about our culture, I think you're right. And this is, I think, part of the wounding that your work and the work of Rohr and others is helping address, which is if we don't build an external framework around the massive suffering humans go through as individuals and as collectives, we can't create that holiness that Rohr recognizes inside of it. And when we don't do that, I think it can create a spiral where instead of people feeling like suffering can be redeemed, not that it is intrinsically good or we have to tell people your pain is good, but that pain is a sign that something sacred is happening to you. And that culture has traditionally had some ways of finding and enclosing that in a way that was deeply meaningful in initiation rituals in which you felt a definitive, I have been upgraded. I have been elevated. I'm now part of a new world because I've gone through this. And we don't have that. And I think that chaos feels like, therefore, everything you go through can just feel like a loop. Oh, I was doing good, then I'm doing bad. I felt like I had purpose, now I've lost it. Now I'm getting my life coach, but it's the third time. And I think the truth is, the good news is there are patterns. There's patterns to these things. And I think those ancient initiation structures, they were built on an objective or transpersonal structure that we can actually tap into, that has scientific and emotional and physical bases, but is really about transcendent experience. And there's a kind of law to it, I think. There's a law, and that I think is very, very comforting. We do not suffer for no reason. I think that's one of the most primordial laws that these traditions teach, is suffering is never pointless.
That's really good. I'm just taking notes because I got so many questions now. I appreciate what you said there about the fact that we have patterns. I also appreciate what you said about philosophy and Socrates, and you said something about Jesus, and we're going to go back and I'm going to see if we can get through all that because I'm super excited about it. But if we think about the idea that there are patterns that we can trust, Jung talked about these as archetypes, and folks can get real intellectually abstract about it. But the idea that there's patterns that we can trust, that there is a pattern. I'm a more of a devotional than a scholarly devotee of a mystical expression of Christianity, but I have this deep love for the Gospel of John, which begins with this idea: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In some English translations, and the word for word is logos, and logos gets translated as word. But I've also heard logos talked about as logic and end pattern. You do some really interesting things with it. What is this idea? What is logos? And what is this idea that's trying to be conveyed to us in the mystical reading of the Gospel of John, that this is in the beginning? It's a foundational part of existence. Does that question make sense?
It does. Wow, Mike, that's as deep as it goes. I love that you're connecting, because I wasn't consciously thinking when I was saying pattern and logos, but that's definitely the beautiful, I think, underlying realm that we're entering into when we talk about this. Yes, I made a strange discovery, which I want to give full credit to Sarah Ruda in her beautiful translation of the Gospel. She has at the inauguration was the true account, or I think that's how she puts it. And
that's great.
The reason. So we say word, and it makes complete sense. It's not totally wrong, although there's other Greek words for like the literal single word. But I realize as a philosopher, logos is actually connected to two very different things that are utterly disconnected, including in translation. So here's one example that's really important. Our idea of proof, the word proof, is the word logos. So the definitive instance of this is Aristotle, who in his logical writings describes what makes what we would call the most rigorous kind of proof that we then see used by Euclid in his Elements of Geometry. So we're talking about really rigorous proof, and that is like self-evident premises, like the axioms in Euclid, and then you see the process, and then you literally can see the constructed result, the circle, the isosceles triangle. If anyone doesn't know, just look at the very first part of Euclid. It might take a couple hours or ask a friend, but when you can do that very first proof yourself, which is about using circles and then using circles to draw triangles, it's really amazing, because then you're like, okay, what is the word for that? Aristotle says we translate this as true account often. That's why Sarah Rudin is going more with the way philosophers often translate logos, because the logos and logein, the verb, has to do with calculating or making a demonstration. So on the one hand, logos literally could be translated as in the beginning was the proof. So that's the first thing I realized, and I thought that's really interesting. On the other hand, logos also is a narrative. So here's another example. The Orphic legends are really famous in ancient philosophy and religion, right? They're connected to the mysteries, the things we're talking about. And Orpheus was he was considered in Greece the kind of founder of magic and music, because they were really one. And he was, he could play music so beautifully with his pipes, and he was such a gorgeous musician that he attracted everyone, even people who ended up killing him. And if people don't know the legend, it's quite a kind of visceral, traumatic story. Orpheus is eventually destroyed, but he keeps on singing. Even his head, which is decapitated, is still intact and singing. In fact, the legend is that it still exists, perfectly pristine, still sort of singing, and that it'll be restored. So, but the idea is, why would you have that as a legend of magic? And why would it be connected to all these esoteric traditions you're asking about? It's connected to the Pythagoreans. So the people who gave us math were these strange, like mystical initiates. Plato has an attraction to the same tradition. Socrates refers to it in the same passage I mentioned, the same tradition. So what in the world is going on there? Well, Socrates himself says, I love this. This is how I had the other part of the insight. In the Phaedo, when Socrates is actually in prison, the last moments of his life, and he's going to die, drink the hemlock, his disciples are just utterly dismayed. And he's completely calm. He's been composing hymns for the gods, because he felt like that's what he was supposed to do. And so he says, let me cast a spell to banish your fear of death. And he literally uses the word epodein or epodai, which is the word for singing or magic. So this ancient practice of binding a wound by singing over it, for example, this is what he's referring to. But what he means is argument. He then gives one of the first arguments in Western philosophy for the immortality of the soul. That's his magic. So I realized, okay, you have these stories. And when you talk about sacred stories, the word in Greece is hieros logos, a sacred tale. So literally the word logos is proof, and it can also be legend or narrative. So I think one of the best ways to translate John 1, which I've put out in my work, is at the origin or at the root of everything was the story. And the story was with God, and the story was about God, and God was the story. That is a very literal translation. And you could say understanding, it's not just a story, it's a story which is somehow a proof. This is what's really powerful, is that you could also say in the beginning was the proof, and the proof was with God, and the proof was about God, and God was the proof. And that goes right to the certainty you're talking about that we mentioned with Jung. So I think that that's maybe a beginning. That's how I see, and that proof is the patterns we're talking about. And like you say, archetypes, I don't think of them as intellectual at all. I think Jung knew that was like a danger, right? An archetype to me, it's like if someone's like, what does an archetype mean to you as an individual? I think my understanding of Jung and Plato, because of course it's a Platonic idea, is the ideas in Plato and the archetypes in Jung are not ideas. In a sense, you could say, well, what do you mean? Well, imagine where if you're a musician and you are very confident if you just sit down, you can make music. Say you improvise. You do not consciously think, oh, I'm going to do this chord in this pattern. That's only something you do if you're learning music really in the beginning. Once you learn how to use a pattern, even if you consciously never thought about it, it goes into your unconscious and it becomes you. And not only it becomes you, but you could say it becomes your music, and it's becoming. If it's a good pattern, it's a very attractive pattern. And we use the word becoming in an ancient way in English to mean attractive. Oh, how very becoming they looked. And that becomingness that's beautiful is when a person has become the pattern of the archetype. So the archetype is not an idea that you consciously are reflecting on with a part of your mind that's split away from you or living. The archetype is when you begin to internalize from your own experience, I think especially through suffering and redeeming your suffering and being deeply confused and hurt, and then learning to understand why you were confused and hurt. Those are patterns no one can take away from us. They give us a rootedness in the arche, which is that beginning in the arche. Arche is the same word for the premise of an argument in Aristotle. So the arche of a logos, translated in Greek logic or philosophy, is the premise of a proof. And those are the exact two words that begin John's gospel, in arche and halogos. In the premise or the root was the proof. And you can absolutely read it that way, but you can also say at the beginning was the story. And so to me, I recognize both of those things are one. It makes sense why we've divided them and split them, but I think we're entering into a new period of consciousness where we can actually recognize the beginning is not just the beginning and it's back there. It's the living root of the present proof of the pattern that we know from our own experience is guiding us to greater and greater life. I think that's in a sense then that's why the logos then I think is then identified in the story was life, Zoe. And what is Zoe? Zoe is what Jesus says he is in John 14:6. He says, I am Zoe. And Zoe is a feminine goddess in Greek culture and in the Hebrew Jewish tradition. Zoe is the original name of Eve in the Greek Bible. This is a great kind of weirdly neglected mystery, but it says, right, her name was Zoe because she was the mother of all living beings. And it's a pun based on the Hebrew. It says her name was Zoe because she was the mater ton panton zone tone, living beings. Zoe because she's the mater of the zone tone. So every living being, according to the Greek translation of the Jewish Bible, is a living descendant of the energy of Zoe, which is the mother. And Jesus, an apparently male figure in Palestine in the first century, said, I'm the mother. Which is really strange. But then John 1 he's suggesting that right in the beginning. In the life, the feminine source of all energy is light, and the light is the light that illuminates all human beings coming into existence. That light is the story. That light is the pattern. That's how I understand it.
That's amazing. And the idea that that light is the story and the pattern, I see borne out, taking it back to what we're talking about with you. Every now and then I encounter people who I will say, and this is like a poetic, I don't mean to be trite here, but people who seem illuminated by that. Jung is one example. Jung, who spent so much time studying the deep stories of humanity, so much time in the patterns, and in that was himself enlightened, and then sort of lived it and demonstrated it and shared it in so many different expressions of wisdom. And what's fun for me is I see that in the way that you talk about Socrates and Jesus, which is very different, and the way that you talk about philosophy. I always experienced, philosophy as something very dry and abstract and intellectual. I got really lucky when I was an undergrad. My first philosophy professor was a wild man, and he would just, gesticulate and get very theatrically dramatic in front of the classroom and be like, philosophy is philosophia. It's the love of wisdom. It's befriending wisdom, and it's falling in love with wisdom. It's not abstract textbooks. And it was a very Dead Poets Society kind of a moment, but it was so good. And I think in the ways that I've been taught what philosophy is. It's not mythos, it's logos, it's masculine, it's rational, it's logical. Even being taught, when philosophers talk about having a muse or a goddess that's driving them, when Boethius says that he's visited by wisdom in his prison cell, that is very clearly a literary device. They're not saying that actually happened. They're being poetic. These people were intellectuals. They were not having mystical experiences. And it was Peter Kingsley, who we both love, who first said, you can't assume that. You absolutely cannot assume that. If the author doesn't tell you that this is a literary device, you are not allowed to just not take them at their word, that they're actually talking to the goddess. And it's sort of it made philosophy more mystical for me. And then I went back and I looked again, and I was like, this is not what I was taught that it was. So So kick this idea around on this podcast that our wounds lead us to our wisdom. What is wisdom? Let's start there. What is wisdom and what is philosophy? And then I want to talk to you about Socrates.
All right, beautiful. Well, blessings on that teacher. I mean, my piano teacher was also like that, and I assume he was probably a great lover of Plato. I gotta just assume that kind of energy. Wisdom, Sophia, I think in the simplest sense is, first of all, we can define it in relationship to our deepest desire. So wisdom is the answer to our deepest desire. Why? Because wisdom is that which enables us to live the life that we desire. So every human being wants, and they can't help but want, to have a beautiful, prosperous, flourishing life. And all of our pain and frustration is because our desire for that feels frustrated. Or maybe worse, if we're in despair, it feels impossible. So the first thing is wisdom is the answer to how do you get what you most want. And that the answer to that is it's how you learn to live well. So from that, we can then say that's wisdom as the answer to desire. Then what is wisdom? Wisdom is a power or a skill. And this is how Socrates and Plato often describe it in the ancient philosophers. And this is exactly as you say, it's connected to what is philosophy. Why did it, this abstract thing we're talking about, that's called philosophy. And there's some merit in that, but that doesn't matter to everyone. And a lot of times it is a betrayal. Let's just be honest. It's a betrayal of what philosophy really is. Philosophy is fundamentally, in my understanding, as a scholar and a practitioner, and the work I've put out in Becoming Human and my Becoming Human project and the work I'm writing my academic book about is to bring this argument to the world of scholarship, but also to everyone, because philosophy is, I would say, the fundamental human practice by which we realize our humanity. And why? Because philosophy is the love of wisdom, like your teacher said, and love is a deep erotic connection. It's not just like, oh, I like this. It's you long for it. And so you could say, well, what is wisdom that we would long for it? Well, when you understand wisdom is what you need to get what you want, you can begin to elevate your consciousness and recognize wisdom is what you're wanting. That's why Proverbs, the book of wisdom in the Bible, right? It begins in Proverbs 1 saying, my son, get wisdom. The idea is Solomon teaching his young son, and he says, get wisdom, my son. And wisdom says in Proverbs 8, I have everything you want. I've got gold, silver, treasure, and honors in my left and my right hand. I have them. So wisdom is the thing that promises the material prosperity you want, you're not going to find by pursuing. And we know this because people become really rich because they wanted just to become rich, also become really unhappy as a result of having succeeded. And that's the paradox. Success used to just mean an outcome. In English, success in Francis Bacon's time, in the late 1500s, 16th century, the word success meant the outcome of something, even if it was bad. Weirdly, today, success has come to mean only if the outcome is good. But you could say, I think you always get what you want. I think you always do what you want as a human being. And so if you want most to have certain kinds of things, I think generally you will. But if you don't realize you had a deeper desire for like meaning, harmony, of people who love you in your life, the ability to receive graciously, the ability to give bountifully, if you didn't want those things, then you'll find in having achieved what you wanted, you did it by cutting yourself off from the deeper source of desire. And what that means philosophically is you didn't understand you were actually looking for wisdom, and so you sort of lost touch with it. So I think wisdom is what we want. It's the power to live well. And at the deeper level, if you want to go mystical, wisdom, I think, is our direct participation in the divine archetype of ourselves.
Oh my God, I love that so much.
We become it.
Oh, the direct participation in the divine archetype of ourselves. That's so beautiful. And in Jungian terms, I think about it's the self with a capital S. It's
right.
the wholeness of ourselves making itself real in our lives. And sometimes there's a trickster in it, right? In the Jungian thought system, because we don't always actually, as you're saying, we're not always in touch with our deepest desires. So often if we think our deepest desire is material wealth and we're constantly pursuing it and then self-sabotaging that, some Jungians say that's the deep self at work, tricking us into figuring out what we really want.
Right. I think that's so true.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I grew up Pentecostal Christianity. There's some old spirit-filled Pentecostal preachers, and while there was a lot of really damaging fundamentalism for me, there was some good teaching as well. And I remember some of those old Pentecostals loved the verse. There's a verse somewhere in the Hebrew Bible, I think it's in Proverbs, it says God gives us the desires of our heart, and they would always say that has a double meaning. It doesn't just mean that God's going to give you what you want. It means that God put the desire there in the first place. So the pursuit of desire is always an education of desire. We're always chasing what we desire while also learning what we actually desire. And I love the idea that philosophy helps us get there. The way you're describing it to me is not an abstract intellectual system. It sounds like medicine for the soul.
Amen. Well, that's what I think it is. In fact, I love that you could say philosophy is the education of desire. That's a really good description of it. The way I understand it is that otherwise, to me, it's like, why would it be worth bringing to people, right? It's like if you just have academic or intellectual knowledge, that isn't actually always useful. Sometimes we need that. Like, absolutely, we need it to understand something or orient ourselves. But so often what we need are things connected to our feelings or our desires, or like material reality. Like, my material reality around me doesn't seem right. And in our culture, we've split this. You have all these self-help people who are looked down on by academics, or mystics who are maybe not always looked down on, but often looked down on by academics because academics don't know what to do with them. And in reality, that split is what I'm trying to address and heal in my work, which is, I've noticed as a coach who applies philosophy with people, the hardest thing people often struggle with when I work with them is, Tony Robbins and all of the systems of self-help today, which are so great, they always start with saying, write down your vision, right? Write down your vision. And that's the right thing to do. But what I found is people cannot do that. Like, I found that I've worked with people for years before they could actually get to the vision, because that's the part that the reason people are lost is because a vision, meaning what you really want your life to be, it's exactly because we don't know what that is and we don't know how to touch it, that I think we often become distressed or depressed. And I agree, it's like a trickster element of, I think, if you really want wisdom, then if you're blessed, your life will do whatever it takes to you. Yeah. Which sounds tough, and it is. It's like tough love. It'll do whatever it takes for you to become awakened to the fact that what I'm pursuing right now is not actually what I most need. And it's in the deeper reality means it's not what I most want. It's somehow on the other side of it. It's a fruit. It's not the tree. And the psyche wants us to focus on become the tree. Don't worry about the fruit. But if you pursue fruit, you often become a thief without realizing it psychologically.
Oh, that's really good. That's really, really good. If you pursue fruit, you often become a thief without realizing it. That has been my experience, because I think when I revisit my personal vision, mission statement, whatever, every year at the end of the year. I'll turn 49 on the 4th of January. And so basically the Advent season through my birthday is a great time to revisit my priorities, my wounds, all these things. And it has been a process of getting there, from initially it focusing on these sort of external material achievements. I want to write a book. I want to have this kind of successful program. I want to have this impact on the world, to sort of, and those things all still there. That's great. But they've gradually fallen away to more of like, I want to heal this wound. I want to wrestle with this curiosity. I want to have my life stand for making love more real in the world and showing people that they can put their wounds in the service of healing their world. And that to me is easier to live with, and it feels more internally located. But when I have just looked for the outward expressions of that, the desire to force my way into them and compete with other people for them is real. Like that becoming a thief when you're just looking for fruit. Oh my gosh. Wow. I'm going to sit with that one for a while. Thank you for that. That's really good. Let me ask you this. So there's, again, so much. We got to talk Socrates for a minute, because you keep referencing Socrates. You've talked about Socrates, child of a midwife, having all this feminine imagery, practicing magic. This is not the boring intellectual philosopher that so many folks are introduced to. I've heard you refer to Socrates as a magician, and I think as a martyr for his culture. And I might be paraphrasing you a bit there. Let's use Socrates as an example of all these amazing things you're talking about. How in the world is Socrates a magician for folks who might be listening going, I know what you're saying, but for folks who might be listening going, wait, what, is he pulling a rabbit out of a hat? Take us in.
I'm okay, thank you. Yeah, I am pulling a rabbit out of the hat. So, right, the hat is philosophers are generally at best, kind of occasionally useful or stimulating intellectuals. But the idea, a magician is something very different. And I don't mean a stage magician or a magician that literally pulls the rabbit. I mean the kind of real magician. So it's like, so what was a magician? And this is, and from this we can talk about Jesus if you want. So let me try to give a brief explanation of a lot of really fascinating historical facts that I discovered that connect to this deep story. So first of all, philosophers and magicians, and this is not well known, this is something I'm bringing out of my scholarship, philosophers and magicians were actually interchangeable in the ancient world. So I have behind me, I'm setting up my shelf, Lynn Thorndike wrote this 8-volume history of experimental science and magic. It's one of the greatest works in the history of science. Now, why is it a history of experimental science and magic? Because Thorndike says in the very beginning, he realized to write a history of how we got to the idea of experimental science, he had to write a history of magic because they're not separate. So first of all, as a historian of science, one of the things I remind people is the history of science will lead you back to the history of magic if you're a real historian. You can't avoid it. So first of all, science and magic are deeply connected. Now, what is science? Science is natural philosophy. Science was called philosophy for all of history until 150 years ago. So that's the first step. Second step is, what's this connection between philosophers and magicians? Well, most of the great ancient philosophers literally had reputations as magicians, including Plato. Famously, Empedocles in Kingsley's work was a great magician. Jesus was regarded as a magician. We know this, sometimes as a slanderous attack, but also as like, he's awesome, isn't he? That's why we worship him. He has all this power. So why were philosophers regarded as magicians, and is there any evidence? Yes. Here's first very powerful evidence from the history of art. The two dominant first images of Jesus in the history of art that begin in the 2nd century are Jesus as a philosopher, wearing the Roman garb the philosophers wear, or Jesus as a magician. And this is a fact. And in fact, it's a fact that Christian art history is not assimilated yet. They don't know what to do about it. And that's because they're not reading the history of philosophy, which makes sense. They think it's a different area. Why were philosophers and magicians identified? Because philosophy was a divine practice and magic was understood to be something that has to do with the ability to manifest divine power. So magicians were people who were somehow tapped into divine power, maybe through dubious means, but it was always the idea that magic was something that enabled you to do extraordinary things that were wondrous, and that even at the peak of it, magic could make you a god. So in the Greek magical papyri, this extraordinary collection of magical spells, I don't just recommend people browse it, but it's for scholarly purposes, they are real spells. So some magicians still use them. I don't practice that kind of magic, but people call that practical magic. That stuff does work, I think, incidentally, but it's very dangerous. It's like using technology without knowing how it was built. But in that tradition, the philosophers are very important. So Socrates uses the language of magic, like I mentioned in the Apology, and Socrates himself is perceived by many people to have been a divine being. Plato was a famous magician. This is not part of how academics, but if you look, like Thorndike mentions it, he's famous in the history of magic. So in the history of magic, Plato is one of the great magicians. So why are philosophers and magicians always linked? They're linked because of wonder, exactly what you're talking about in your work in this podcast. Wonder is the basis of philosophy. Plato says all philosophy begins in wonder. And what a magician does from the standpoint of the effect is they make us wonder. So what I say is the philosopher begins with wonder, and the life of philosophy manifests as magic. So if you begin with your own personal wondering, and you deal, as you say, with your wounds, and you go on the journey of wandering, the work you do will be divine, and it will be magic. It will be magic.
Oh man, that's so good. And it screws so many light bulbs all the way in for me. Again, not as a scholar, but as someone who has a very keen interest, it helps me understand Solomon as a philosopher, right? Who was in Hebrew thought the wisest man that ever lived, and also someone who had, sort of mystical powers and power over demons and forces. When you read the myths and legends and folktales about him, and it helps me even think about why so many later philosophers were also hermeticists, right? And known to be alchemists of sorts. Would that be like a later expression of the same kind of idea of the wise person is also the magician?
Absolutely. It's in fact, to go back to our recurring theme with Jung. Jung, of course, had these famous comment about himself, like that he was just a kind of witch doctor dressed up in the garb of Western modern science. And I think Jung was being honest, both knowing from the standpoint of like ancient indigenous cultures, some of whom, of course, he met, like he describes in his work, those leaders saw him as a counterpart. Like he's obviously a kind of white shaman or something in the standpoint of if you were translating him. He didn't call himself that. But Jung, I think, really deeply knew his alchemical work. Like I think Jung knew what he was doing was absolutely what historically we would have called magic.
Yeah.
And that's why I would distinguish very strongly like magic as part of the tradition of philosophy and what people will sometimes call sorcery, which in the Greek is a word goeteia, which is a purely negative word. It's a very insulting word. So Jesus is called a goete sometimes, and that's an insulting word. It's like a charlatan, but not necessarily because you're fake. But like somehow you're dubious. You're just maybe consulting with demons and got some tricks from them. And so you're exploiting people. But magus, or mageia, the word we have for magic that comes from the magi, the Zoroastrian priests, that had a more, you could say, high-toned element. And so if you could say that magus is ambiguous. It could be insulting, but also really cool. So Jung is a modern magus. And that's not just like making up a description. That's really one of the best ways to describe him. And I'm currently have a deadline on an essay I'm writing about technology as magic for a book, a scholarly book. So I think that technology is really the current form of practical magic, and it's not just a metaphor. It's the spiritual work that we need is I think to counter what you could say is a type of technological sorcery, meaning magic you can do that's irrespective of your own self-development. That's what people traditionally call dark magic. It's power that's independent of the individuation process.
Yeah.
If you want power that is not linked to you wanting to be a person who can use power well, you might get it to the detriment and danger of yourself and those around you. But if you want to know the answer to your personal wonder, if you want to genuinely just know things, that turns out to give you powers to bless, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of what the inner magic of wisdom is that wisdom produces the kind of magic, the fruit of which is healing.
God, that's so good. And I think that's not my main point, but that thing on technology is interesting because one of the things Jung always wrestled with was the trickster and the technology. Why is it that our time-saving devices rob us of time, right? Was one of the questions he asked. And I think it's because technology is created at whatever stage of wisdom or individuation we're in when we create the technology. And so we project our own unreconciled issues, our lack of wisdom into the technology we create to solve our problems, which very often creates more problems than it solves because it carries that same immaturity. So I'm going to think about that for a while, and I really look forward to reading that essay when it comes out. Let me ask you a fun contemporary question, then I want to go back to the ancient world and then ask you a question about your story, and we'll be done. If you got a little more time to hang
Absolutely.
out. So here's a fun contemporary question. This idea of the magician, who is the person who is wise and powerful. I've been wondering lately about the prevalence of the word wizard in our culture. Like the wizard is a motif in an archetype that I don't know if it's post-Tolkien, but it's gotten really, really popular, right? You had sorcerers and maguses and so on and so forth. You think about like Merlin. Merlin now, if you ask someone who is Merlin, people will go, well, Merlin was Arthur's wizard. But when you go further back, he wouldn't have been necessarily referred to as a wizard. It's become, and I love my Dungeons and Dragons. We live in a world where The wizard is a recognizable term for someone who is wise and, because of that wisdom, in touch with many different types of abilities and powers. And as far as I can tell, again, wizard's been around as a word, as a wise one for a long time, but it wasn't sort of the catch-all word that it's become. And I wonder if the popularity and the prevalence of the word wizard, from everything from Tolkien to Harry Potter to everything else in our culture right now, is this sort of unconscious desire to recapture the idea that the truly wise are more than just abstract intellectuals. How does that hit you?
It's right on. And I love, too, what you said leading up to it about technology. So, in fact, I'll use it to connect with what you kindly said about like the interview and the magic wand. I think I could explain or express like a kind of harmonization, really, of what you're saying with the fact that every human being is looking for a magic wand or a staff. Like Moses had a magic wand, he had a staff. A lot of the early Christian art connected to him as a magician, shows him with a wand. Some people contest this, but it's quite clearly a wand. Like the Dura Europa exhibit, this famous early synagogue art we discovered, some of it's at Yale, and I had the privilege of seeing it and taking students when I was teaching on tour to look at it. And it literally has one of these famous images. It's very early, 2nd century, of Jesus with a kind of willow wand when he's like raising a person. So what is like the wizard? Yes, I think is absolutely the wizened one, the old person who has cunning power. And so the link between knowledge and power has always been primordial, and modernity separated it. And so I think you're exactly right that you could see the prevalence of wizardry and the idea and the archetype of the wizard to be, we know knowledge is supposed to be linked to efficacy. And in fact, I think that's why Silicon Valley really embraces this cult and believes in it, like that they're wizards, techno mages. I think most of the people really actually do think that, and they're not wrong, right? Part of what my essay is talking about is a well-known fact that we don't think enough about, which is that most of the biggest desires of traditional magic have been realized. Flight, scrying, where you look into a mirror and you can see things. We're now scrying. We are currently inside of a magical system where photons, light, through like incredibly advanced knowledge, is permitting us to see each other, and people can hear us because of these electrical connections. So electricity and fire is binding a spell of our words into the world, which can spread it in real time. Like we're inside of magic. And how does the magic work? It's the logos of techne. It's the logic of expert labor. And that logic, like you said, I think it encodes its founders. And if they're not wise, I think, which they don't have to be, they just have to be expert, which is not the same thing as a wizard. A wizard is not an expert. A wizard is a person who has somehow cunning, which is a lot more than just, I can do my tiny part in an engineering project. The wizard is like the one-man show, right? That's the idea, is you don't want just but an engineer, you could say, becomes a type of wizard. If you have a person who can build a bridge to span that's the kind of thing Merlin would be needed to do. So I think Merlin, we could talk so much about Merlin. I actually love Merlin. So if you wanted to, I would go on a whole Merlin riff. But I think Merlin is coming back. I think Merlin has never left. And the rise of Gandalf and then Harry Potter and, the Earthsea trilogy with Ursula K. Le Guin, all of these things are part of a clear psychological pattern in which wizardry is actually literally forcing itself back into mainstream consciousness.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll say this: we could do. Let's do 5 minutes on Merlin, and then we'll bounce back to Jesus. But when I really grabbed the healer with 1,000 faces thing, I was hanging out with a good buddy of mine named Alexander Marcus, who's just a buddy of mine here in Albuquerque, and I described my idea of the healer with 1,000 faces and the whole, like, we're wounded, our wounded leads us on our wandering, it leads us to our wondering. And he said, oh, that's Merlin. And I said, no, it's Parsifal. It's the hero. It's not the wise guide. And he said, go back and look at Merlin again. And I went back and I looked at Merlin again and I went, oh my God, I'm looking at this all wrong. So Merlin has loomed large in my thoughts the last few months, and I would love to hear anything you want to say about Merlin.
I'm so tempted. Let me see if I can find it right now. I literally have a book I just read on Merlin, which is a really
Well,
good book. And
do this. Grab your book, because the wind also just blew my back door open. So I'm going to go close the door. You grab that book, and we'll reconvene. I'm also going to have to order that book, whatever it ends up being.
You know what?
So.
I feel like I know it's in here. I will send it to you. It's a scholarly
Perfect.
book, although it's written with a popular. But here's the amazing thing I wanted to grab. Maybe I can just Google it. It has all of this poetry from the earliest Welsh chronicles about the figure who becomes Merlinus in Latin, and then Merlin in English. And oh boy, I don't want to waste your time, but I know it's like right here. It's like, so there's something wonderful about it, sort of hiding. But so here's the connection
Love
that
it.
I think is part of what you're saying is, yes, I think it's so interesting your friend said that, because originally Merlin is this figure historically who was a Welsh sage or bard, and they were magicians. The Irish tradition preserves the most, I think, form of this, but like in the Irish tradition, for example, of a bard, you had to have what we would unquestionably call magical skills. You had to have, for example, the final level of divinization. You had to be able to divinize or do enchantment and syncing with your fingers. And if you read
Wow.
the Zohar, the great text of Jewish mysticism, in the passage called Beishalach, which is about Moses and the parting of the Red Sea, it's about magic. It literally talks about there's great power in the fingers, and when a human being is actualized all 10 fingers, the power manifests. So, but that's part of the esoteric stuff about your hands are connected to your brain and your spinal cord. And so people who have access to all 10 of their fingers are magicians. That's also the connection between sleight of hand and actual magic, is like they can do things that are magic, and it's because of the hands. So but Merlin is mad. The original Merlin was a figure who goes mad through grief, writes this incredible poetry which is preserved in Welsh, and it's haunting, like really haunting. Like I was reading this work, and so Merlin the magician comes out of Merlin a kind of suffering mad bard. And so there is the background to the magician. And I think about Gandalf, right? People think, well, if you're a magician, why do you have any problems? It's like, that's not actually like real magic. Even in Harry Potter, all real magic does not solve our core human problems, right?
No.
The Weasleys are still poor, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Like they're struggling in the English magical class
Yeah.
system, right? They're like a noble but impoverished family. What magic does, you could say, is it manifests a relationship to like reality that magicians have that is pure. You can misuse it, but the relationship itself with Merlin, I think, Merlin is the archetype, and I don't think it's just an archetype. I think there's something very strangely literal about Merlin, where he's both Christian and non-Christian. Which people point out, Merlin is a very enigmatic figure. He is part of the Christian legend of England. He's essential to the idea of the English monarchy, because Merlin is the one who plays the role of Samuel and crowns the David who is Arthur. So in the one sense, Merlin is essential to the Christian mythology of kingship, the Arthurian legend. On the other hand, Merlin is not a traditional Christian figure at all, even in the Christian legends of Merlin, which is really weird. So it's like, who is this guy? C.S. Lewis, as you may know, in his Space Trilogy, his last book, he has Merlin come back. So I think Merlin stands for the fact that our divisions of categories, our identitarian structures of science, technology, magic, religion, politics, these things all being separate, they do not map on to power. Real power manifests concretely as a person who shatters our capacity to categorize. So I think Merlin is the ultimate destruction of our attempt to categorize things and control them. Magicians are people who you cannot control. And the primary way that we control people is by putting them into categories. And that's the biggest act of magic, is I say, oh, I understand you're an conservative, or you're a progressive, or you're a mystical type, or, oh, you're an academic. And what we do in doing that is magic. It's apopotreic magic to ward off influence. And you ward off influence by defining people so they can't get through to you, because you already know what they are. And you cannot do that to Merlin. We just are obsessed with Merlin. And so the magician awakens our eros. It awakens this totally uncategorizable, just like, this is so cool. It's kind of scary, but I would definitely want to meet Merlin, but I'm afraid if I didn't meet Merlin. And that's why magic is so important, I think, because we want it and we should stop pretending we don't. Technologists know they want it. People want magic. So the danger is if you pursue magic, to me, not as philosophy.
Yeah.
But I think if you just look at our culture, we treat our technologists like they're wise men, whether that's wise or not. I don't think it often is, because that's not what they got powerful from being. So I think, the figure of Merlin is a figure who, through intense suffering, already had a bunch of powers that then manifested a completely new way that confound all categories, and yet paradoxically lie at the foundation of all categories. So all of what we call the modern mist, the vision of imperial England, literally was created by the magus of Elizabeth. He was a magician, John Dee. And not only was he a magician, he was a great scientist. He wrote one of the most important books on navigating that allowed the British to become the great seafaring empire they were. And he is the one who brought the Arthurian legend, convinced Elizabeth that her family line was directly connected to Arthur, and planted the seeds of the modern idea to this moment that the English monarchy is a direct descendant of the magic of Merlin through Arthur. That's not science fiction. That's historical fact.
Oh man! All right, I wish we had another hour to unpack this, because I'm thinking about Rasputin, I'm thinking about all these other things, and I'm thinking about these sort of magicians who influence history for what you just described, and our inability to recognize them as such leaves us susceptible to their machinations of the more malevolent variety, and also what you said about using categorization as a way to ward off influence. Thinking about Merlin, I can't help but go back to Jesus. Jesus is magician, right? If there's anyone who culture has attempted to categorize in a way to ward off influence, like, this is the world that I live in, where to some Jesus is a mystic, to some Jesus is a prophet, to some Jesus is a liberator, to some social reformer, to some Jesus is a Palestinian philosopher, to others Jesus is the manifest revelation of the Godhead, to some Jesus is a sacrificial lamb. And all of those very valuable lenses into who and what Jesus was are also ways to sort of block out some of the other components of a figure that's too big to categorize. I think I told you this when you and I spoke last time. One of my most precious teachers, who recently passed away, Dr. Barbara Holmes, whose specialty was contemplative practices of the Black church and then redefining contemplation through indigenous wisdom. And she used to talk all the time about Jesus as shaman, building on Marginalia Review understanding of what shamanism was, right? Starting with this case study, the shaman is a Siberian word, this particular type of local, wise, powerful healer that would serve a community. And then Eliade recognizing that using the word shaman to recognize a sort of something that expressed itself in cultures all over the world, right? So the shaman is a Siberian word, but there are now what we refer to as shamans the world over. And Dr. B looked at Jesus and was like, Jesus is a shaman. He's a Palestinian shaman. That's what he was understood in that culture. He talked to animals and angels. He talked to the dead. He performed miracles. That's what he did. That was his vocation. Which sounds a bit, first of all, like what you're talking about as magician. Do you think there's
I think it's exactly,
there?
I think it's right. And I think it's right. The shaman, and this is connected to the magical argument, like Kingsley and others will argue that Socrates was a shaman. In fact, E.R. Dodds he was a famous classicist in the 50s or 60s, and he wrote a book called The Greeks and the Irrational, which was very controversial because he was a very famous scholar. But he said Socrates has all the appearance of a shaman. This was a very kind of staid, we would say very conservative academic. And that work has not really been assimilated, I would say, except Kingsley has brought it to a different level. So, Yes, people often debate whether these categories are applicable, but I think it is very helpful because the problem with all the categories you described isn't because any one of them isn't valid. It's because they think they exclude the others.
Bingo.
And that's the magical part. Is it's like I call it. It's like the principle, right, of exclusivity. Is we often are wrong not about what we think, but what we think it means. So I think Jesus is a philosopher. Like Morton Smith wrote a famous book on Jesus as a magician, but he doesn't have the concept of magic linked to philosophy because he wasn't a philosopher. He was
Sure.
So that's fine. So it's a good book, but it can be misleading. I noticed if you look at famous philosophers, they are often called magicians, either by their enemies or by people who like magic and like magicians and recognize they are a part of their tradition. So I thought, why are philosophers and magicians often called the same thing and we separated them? Well, we think science and philosophy and magic are totally separate. So as a result, if you work on one thing, you don't think it's related to the other category. And that's the mistake. The mistake is not that Jesus wasn't a prophet or that Jesus wasn't a philosopher or that but the power of shaman. It's like if I have to pick a category where all of this stuff that's strange makes sense. Like, yeah, how is a philosopher raising people from the dead? But then you read Eliade and you recognize that's one of the things philosophers do is they guide souls, they're a psychopomp. And they also can call souls back. Like, you have 3 days off and people thought, and maybe you can go find the soul and the shaman would go into a trance. And so when someone recently died, like the young girl, and then Jesus said, just tell the people she's alive. And then he goes in and he brings her back. That is literally shamanic activity. So I think he's exactly right. Like including in a very just narrow technical way. That's not normally what we would say a philosopher does, but it's also what the prophet Elisha does in the Bible, Elisha, right? And Elijah is who Jesus is being portrayed as. And who is Elijah? He's the greatest magician in the Bible because, his disciple, therefore, is an even greater magician because Elijah is this great prophet who does all this magic. And then Elisha says, I would like to be your inheritor and have your power. And he says, if you see me go up in the chariot, you'll have a double portion, right?
Yeah.
So who's John the Baptist in the Gospels? John the Baptist is Elijah. So who's Jesus? Yeah. People do not see this. Jesus is
Elisha
with twice the power.
Wow.
And Jesus says in John, there's no greater human being that's lived than John the Baptist. So what does that mean? Who is Jesus if there's no greater human being that's lived than John the Baptist? What would be a double portion of the greatest human being? It's a riddle. It's designed to make you realize if you double humanity, in some sense, what you're thinking about is divinity.
Yeah.
Like so I think that that's part of what we're actually wanting is we're wanting to be able to understand things. But then when we are afraid, we think understanding means you have a clear category. And I think real philosophy detaches you very much like the way the spiritual practice of detachment is found in so many traditions is my work is very dissolving. A lot of people who don't like my scholarship who are scholars, it's not scholarship, but because I'm critical of us being attached to categories like religion.
Yeah.
Instead of being like, hey, this is a useful category for us Western modern people for the past 200 years. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. But maybe we need to understand religion has a magical and a scientific dimension, and science has a religious dimension, and technology has a magical dimension. And this isn't me making stuff up. It's me bringing out the latent force of these powers because they're powers. And when we treat them like categories, we fix them into something that we think we understand or we're okay not understanding any further. But if you have a living power like a gorilla or an elephant walking around your house, you can't pretend you're not actively in a relationship of having to deal with its energy.
Yeah.
And when we put things into categories, what we do is we kill the energy psychically in our consciousness. They don't have any more energetic effect on us. But if something breaks the category, then suddenly you can't help but deal with the fact that you're in a dynamic relationship to it. And that's how we are to ourselves. We're in a dynamic relationship to Jesus that everyone is in, which makes us uncomfortable. Jew, Christian, atheist. We live in 2025. You want to talk about magic? Imagine I said, I, Samuel Joseph Loncar, will have the next 2,000 years named after me.
Yeah.
That's my spell, okay? That's the only spell I'm going to do. If you imagined a sci-fi story in which I pulled that off, people probably like, okay, let's call that guy a magician. That was a pretty big one.
It's pretty good.
Jesus claimed to know time. We don't know what that means. He claimed to predict the end of the world, but we've named time after him.
Yeah.
So there is something, as you say, utterly uncontrollable about him that I think your teacher, Dr. B, was getting at.
Yeah.
And that I think is really important for like what we're going to now as a human species. We're evolving into a stage in which the last thing that needs to happen is for us to let our categories go. And that's why we seem, I think, struggle right now, because the last place to hide your fear and to hide your resistance is let me reinforce categories, whether of nation,
Yeah.
state, or party, anything. But a category is not a living being and
Yeah.
the life of ourselves.
Yeah, it's so true. I used to say of Dr. B, her particular form of teaching, which was so academic and so mystical, because she was a scholar and she was also a Gullah woman and a shaman in her own right. I always said she reintroduced me to a crowded cosmos.
I love that.
Yeah.
A crowded cosmos.
Yeah. Yeah. It was just, every categorization is a sheet that's too small. And, you pull it up over your torso and your feet are sticking out. There's no, they just don't fit, and reality is so much bigger and more beautiful. And I love this sort of invitation to step into a magical reality, which I hope everyone listening hears, and what we're talking about is to let life be bigger and bolder than the categories that we try to enforce upon it. And I find sometimes that it's lived experience that shatters our categories. So I have to ask you, before we run out of time, if you can do one more big question. One of my favorite Jungians, James Hollis, says, don't try to be happy, find what you love and let it kill you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's real.
And so in talking about the love of wisdom, I have to ask two questions. One, has philosophy almost killed you? And two, has it saved your life?
Yes, and yes. And this is the part where, because I'll be honest, it's like the anti-advertising, you could say, but yes, philosophy. I remember I was working with a Jungian analyst for 3 years, and at some point I finally said, something which I think I felt, but I had never said out loud because it made me very uncomfortable to say it. You know how we often have that fear that if you say a thing, it'll, like, that's like we're all superstitious, so-called, and it's not superstition. What we call, like, our psychology knows something. Like, if we're afraid to say something, the one thing we know is because there's power in it. Whatever that power is, good, bad, it's powerful. And what I was afraid to say is, like, I lost my faith. Like, even though in some ways it's so obvious that I've evolved so much differently than the external forms that I was raised in, even though I respect them profoundly and I'm grateful for them and I honor the good that they've done for me. But so you could say, well, why would that be hard to acknowledge? Well, because I think there was something really profoundly, like, attached to, like, I feel like a failure spiritually or a betrayer. But the other thing I was afraid to say is, like, my search for truth has, like, destroyed my life.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to pretend that this isn't true. I will say with an absolute, I think Hollis is absolutely right. I think if you pursue truth with your whole being, what you know is your whole being will not survive the process. If you pursue truth with your whole being, what you know is your whole being will not survive the process. And does that mean literally dying? I'm not here to tell people what their fate is, but Socrates said the practice of philosophy is dying before you die. I would say, I've gone through that. And as a result, like, I went from a person who used to have a very normal, I think, rational relationship of fear, trepidation around death, to having gone through not just one, but multiple experiences, which, let me be very clear, were unasked for, undesired, profoundly horrifying in the actual moment, but then were transformative. So I have had the literal experience of dying, and then a prolonged illness, which was a very different kind of death, where I thought, like, it was much harder than actually the one, and, like, okay, like, this is the end of my life. I went through that. The only way I can say it is, like, I was sent back from that experience. And that completely changed my life. Like, I had my life for the first time because I knew it had ended. And that happened in my mid to late 20s, right on the cusp of, like, beginning. I then realized 10 years later of when I got really sick. Then I got really sick and I went through a lot of just physical agony and torment, which I'm still healing from psychologically, absolutely. Like you said something really deep, Mike, I've been thinking about since we first talked, that even after getting the doctrine of eternal punishment out of your mind, it took you said, I think, a decade to get it out of your body.
10
I
years.
think I'm still getting it out of my body. And so my own journey has been that everything that I thought I was, every aspect of my life that I thought I would be stable, I think I felt like I lost. And it has made me struggle a lot with feeling like failing, like that failure has become because failure, right, is a proxy for death, right? Valid success is life, failure is death. And so the result of death and failure is a wound, which is very specific, which is the wound in which you no longer believe anything for your future. Like if you survive dying, I think the result is you often don't believe you have any great mission left. Because you could say, well, I'm just happy to be here. But that can be, unfortunately, a way in which we mask the terror of thinking, that was so bad. What if I pursue everything I want and then it happens again? And that's scary even to say. I'm saying it because I've been working on this in myself. But I think that the second part is also true. I would say, I love the Tao Te Ching. I read this translation by Richard Wilson, William Scott Wilson. And, the Tao says return is the movement of the way. And I think that the life that I've regained is a return to a life that is a return, but it's a life I did not know. It's a life that's completely new. It's a life that I don't feel like I control. And I don't feel like that's not only the end of the world, I feel like that's what I'm excited about. Like, I didn't know we were going to meet 1 year ago. I didn't know we were going to have this conversation. And if I have everything planned out, everything great in my life I realized was never part of a plan I had. I'm not saying we shouldn't make the plans. We need a vessel.
Sure.
But the life that's being born in me is, I find, like the life that I'm able to give from having accepted that I've been dying. And to accept that my failures, my worst flaws, the things that I think were totally unjust that happened to me, the things that I think I never should have done that I wish I hadn't made happen to someone else, all of these things mix together and they destroy you. Like, they absolutely kill you if you're at all sane. Like, if you're sane, pursuing life will drive you past what you think of as your sense of sanity. And I think that's why we're so scared of it. It's like Eric Fromm called it the psychopathology of normalcy, that we have to act like we're normal. And he said Americans have the worst form of this because they have to be happy. And so Americans lie about being happy because they're unhappy and they're afraid of being judged for being more unhappy. So it's a terrible loop that Fromm predicted, if we didn't get a hold of it, would really hurt us and damage us psychologically. And I think we have to be able to celebrate, in a sense, the fact that, hey, I'm currently living through a ritual where I think my life is really meaningful, but I'm struggling. I don't know what it means. I'm looking for sources. I'm looking for teachers. And we need a whole world that says, that's great. We're here to celebrate you. We don't expect you to be perfect. We understand you're struggling, but we have categories that will help you to stabilize that, but you don't need to cling to them. Once they're not useful, let them go. We have resources that you need that'll help you get out of your addiction or help you feel compassionate, but you don't have to stick with them. Once you're done, you can evolve. Instead, I think what we have is a kind of, you're this, and then if you're that, you can't leave it. You can't let it go, or it's a new trauma. But I think if we accept, no, life is going to kill you. Like, there's a great poem by Lucille Clifton, this incredible poet who said, to celebrate that every day something has tried to kill you and it failed.
Oh, that's really good.
And I learned that from my great poet, best friend, partner, Alexander Borilsky, this amazing poem. And it's like the part of death, like the beauty of death in this way you're asking about it, is death is not here to end your life. Death is here to kill what you think is your life so that you can begin living. And it will do that. And if we had people telling us that will happen, that's what initiation was. It was people saying, you want to join this community? Then you've got these 3 years to show that you're ready to die. And that is what I think really they were told. That was Origins Mysteries. It was baptism is baptized into the death of the Messiah, Yeshua, resurrected into his new life. So I think this is what we've lost, the idea that it's normal to die and still look like you're here. But don't we then know why we're all ghosts? We look around. Why are we obsessed with zombies? Why do we have all these terrible horror movies? Because deep down, so many of us feel like we're walking dead. So many of us feel like our families somehow destroyed us, imprisoned us. So many of us feel like our past has done that to us. And we feel like I'm not really alive. And the ancient wisdom that is alive in traditions, like you were mentioning from your teacher and Richard Rohr and so many others, this wisdom is not like, it's ancient in the sense of relevant. I think that's what ancient means. Like, it's relevant, it's living. Your ancestors in the past weren't dead, they're alive. I don't think my grandmother's dead. I think she's alive. And I think she's like present to me. And that presence allows me to face death and say, I know this is for my life, which sounds insane. But that's because we've forgotten that that's what life is. Life is like growth and birth. And if we accept that, then I think we can actually evolve new categories that we don't cling to. We just think this is the season of spring. These are the categories for this stage of my life. But the people who love me, they abide. The love abides through all the categories. The love, what dies is our ideas of ourselves, our feeling of ourselves, our concept. And yeah, maybe our infrastructure, our money or whatever, maybe that has to die for us to become reborn. But I would say all the suffering I've gone through, one, I would not wish on anyone, including Adolf Hitler. Two, I would never wish away. I accept it. I'm grateful for it. Not because I think it's going to go on forever, but because I know what the life that I've been given by my pursuit of wisdom has been given to me, not in spite of that suffering, but through it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good magic and good medicine. That's putting your healing in the service of healing the world. I can't add anything to that. That's perfect. That's a perfect way to close, except to say we should do another one of these. And it'd be fun to unpack a little bit. I suspect if we unpacked our journeys of deconstruction, losing faith, losing face, facing death, there would probably be a lot to talk about.
I would love to do that.
Oh my God.
It's such a beautiful space that you're creating and that Rohr and that your colleagues are creating. So it's such a privilege just to be able to share that space with you, share this time.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing philosophy back to what it actually is and bringing back the magic and the medicine. Samuel, this is awesome. Thank you. The time has flown by. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm so excited for other folks to get to hear it. Thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mike.
Friends, what did I tell you? Samuel is awesome. I enjoyed that conversation so much. I learned so much, and I was inspired with so many questions. And as you heard at the end of the episode, in point of fact, Samuel and I did go back and record more conversation about our journeys and our own individual healing paths. You'll get those conversations at the end of this season, but first, I've got a lot more in the vault to share with you. If you would like to know more about Samuel, and you really, really do, check out SamuelLoncar.com and learn more about his Becoming Human project. If you'd like to support us here at The Healer with 1,000 Faces, the best thing you can do is like the podcast on all the platforms we live on, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. Rate us. 5-star rating really, really helps a lot. Leave a review if you're willing to donate 5 minutes to help us get the word out. And above all, tell your friends. Big thanks to my buddy Ryan Keller for producing these episodes, and big thanks to you for listening. I wonder, how is wisdom showing up in your life right now? Where is magic breaking in? What are you wondering about, and how is that leading you to look at your own wounds, but also to an increased sense of wonder in your own life? Are there ways that you're being asked to die before you die? What a beautiful thing to get to sit back and let our wounds lead us to wonder, and in that wondering, to find wisdom. Hey, thanks for listening, friends. We'll see you again soon.